When we're playing our favourite titles, it can be easy to forget that video games are big business. Whether they're a tiny indie outfit or a billion-dollar corporation, ultimately, a company needs to make money so that they continue to turn out, or churn out in the case of some publishers, the games that we love. Or don't, in the case of some publishers. Sadly, where there is profit, there are often a number of shady dealings going on that make that profit possible. For this list then, we're taking a look at some of the things that video game developers, publishers, and other such associated businesses do to make a quick buck that are far from being on the level. Whether they impact their own staff, the consumer, or both, these are the unfair goings-on that we wish the industry would stop. Now don't get us wrong, we understand the reasoning behind why many of these things happen, but reasons don't equal excuses. So we're here to call out this tomfoolery in the hopes that the bigwigs will see the error of their ways. Because I'm sure all the giant studio execs are definitely watching this video right now. We can dream, can't we? I'm Peter from TripleJump, and here are 10 horrible business practices that plague the video game industry. Number 10. Third-party and timed exclusivity. We want to be clear that we're not judging console manufacturers for keeping the games that they produce and whose rights they own on their own hardware. As an example, Microsoft owns the Halo franchise, so it's hardly surprising they'd want to keep it as an Xbox exclusive. No, we're referring to the practice of console manufacturers paying studios to only release games on their platform, or to prevent them from releasing games onto other platforms for a period of time. Some would say that this helps developers to make bigger and better games, but when it comes down to it, the whole idea is very anti-consumer. When studios are paid for exclusivity, some gamers are excluded from playing certain titles unless they're willing to shell out for the relevant console. Unfortunately, not everyone is in a position to do so. Timed exclusivity is probably the lesser of the two evils, as eventually players will be able to get their hands on a game, but it's still quite unfair to those who can't or simply won't buy a new console. After all, if there's only one or two titles you're interested in, things can end up getting very expensive if you have to start shelling out for new hardware for less than a handful of games. Number 9. Publisher interference. There have been many occasions over the years where a game has gone into production with a half-decent premise in mind, but thanks to publisher interference, has ended up being a sack of plops. Usually, this will be fueled by, you've guessed it, money, and may take the form of changes to gameplay mechanics, condensing of timescales, or the addition of things like microtransactions. EA, for example, doomed Dead Space 3 when they insisted on more action-focused gameplay. Sony had a hand in killing Lair by demanding the devs use motion controls, and Konami's meddling in the development of Metal Gear Solid 5 was one of the many straws that broke Hideo Kojima's back. Figuratively, I mean. I'm not suggesting Konami broke Hideo Kojima's back. Oh, and let's not even get started on E.T. the Extraterrestrial, a game that, thanks to Atari's parent company, Warner Communications, ended up being so bad it had to be buried in the desert. Now don't get us wrong, we understand that a publisher needs to be business-minded, and without some level of control, there is a risk that a project could get into hot water. As with everything though, there's a balance to be struck, and it's one that not every publisher has quite nailed down yet. Number 8. Late review embargoes. As we probably mentioned, studios don't make games out of the goodness of their hearts, and even the smallest companies expect to make money when they release a new title. Though marketing goes some of the way to selling a game, much of its success will hinge on how well it does with critics. Whether or not you put much stock into what critics have to say about things, it's true that their opinions can sway people into buying a game, or more importantly, into not buying a game. It's for this reason that very late review embargoes are often placed on new titles, meaning that regardless of whether or not a game is decent, journalists are forbidden from expressing their opinions until half the fanbase has probably already pre-ordered. Generally speaking, very late review embargoes are placed on games that developers and publishers know are going to be absolute tosh, and they do it so that they can sell as many copies as possible before word gets around. This is great for the bigwigs, as they might just get a return on their investment before the world realizes just how bad their game is, but it's not so good for the consumers, who are effectively tricked into buying a subpar title. Number 7. Hype culture. We've lost count of the number of times a game has been hyped into oblivion only to release to a less than stellar reception. The reason this happens is that when promoting a title, studios and publishers will often overpromise and underdeliver. The problem has many facets, but when a game doesn't live up to audience expectations, it's usually down to overzealous creators sharing information about features that just don't exist. We've covered it a lot on the channel, but No Man's Sky was a great example of a developer hyping up various aspects of a game, only for them to be completely different or absent entirely from the finished product. Cyberpunk 2077 was a similar story. The game had been hyped up over years and years, CD Projekt had shared endless cool-looking trailers, and everyone was really excited for this behemoth of a game. Sadly though, when it launched, well, you all know the story. What stung more with Cyberpunk though was the fact that the devs had repeatedly delayed the game, claiming they didn't want to release it until it was perfect. Perhaps if the build-up hadn't been so big, players would have been more forgiving when the finished product was a bit of a mess. Oh, and would you look at that, we got to the end of the entry without even mentioning Peter Molyneux. Oh, sorry, I just mentioned Peter Molyneux, sorry. Number 6. The cost of digital games. Have you ever sat back and pondered the price of video games? You know, besides the fact that paying 70 odd quid for a title is taking the Michael. Does it seem weird to you that digital releases generally cost the same as their disc or cartridge-based counterparts? Because it certainly seems a bit bonkers to us. Now, don't get us wrong, there are an awful lot of reasons to buy games digitally. They don't take up any space in your house, you can play them immediately without having to wait around for delivery, and you don't have to go outside or interact with any other human beings in order to obtain them. Ho full marks. There are downsides though. So less than full marks, I suppose. You can't lend a digital copy of a game to a mate, and once you're finished playing it, you can't take it to a shop to trade in for something new. It's for these reasons that we're baffled as to why digital games cost as much as physical copies. Now, we're not experts on the subject, but we can't imagine that the distribution and manufacturing costs are the same for something that's burned onto a disc, printed onto a plastic box, and then posted around the world, and something that isn't. We also assume that ditching all that plastic is good news for the environment, so it'd be nice to incentivize the purchasing of digital copies in order to live a little more sustainably. Plus, studios aren't at risk of losing any money when it comes to selling digital games, because people can't then trade them in or sell them on second hand. So once again, surely some of those savings should come back to the consumer. It's madness, I tell you. Madness! Number 5. Refusing refunds. If you were to order, let's say, a keyboard off Amazon, and when it arrived, half the keys didn't work, you'd probably feel like you were entitled to a refund, right? Amazon might ask you to send the keyboard back, but they should still reimburse you for the cost of the item. Sadly, consumers often find themselves a bit shortchanged when it comes to defective video games, as many digital storefronts have very rigid rules around when they will and won't offer refunds. Microsoft, for example, considers refunds on a case-by-case basis, taking into account things like when you bought the game and how much of it you've played. Conversely, Sony deem that if you've started to download or stream a game, then you're not eligible for any refunds, quote, unless the content is faulty. Faulty, however, is a subjective term, which means that a title like GTA The Trilogy The Definitive Edition, a game that's riddled with bugs, might not actually be considered refund-worthy because technically it runs. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that some of these policies may be bolstered by local laws, so if your country has mechanisms in place to protect consumers, great! Unfortunately, not everywhere does, and many gamers find themselves at the mercy of these greedy, selfish companies. Number 4. The acquisition and shuttering of small studios. Being a small independent video game studio is a bit of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, there's loads of creative freedom, so developers can create games that they really want to without the fear of the aforementioned publisher interference. On the other hand though, there's probably not all that much in the way of financial stability. Every so often, however, a knight in shining armour in the form of a larger studio will ride in to buy the indie company, therein safeguarding its future. Except where they don't do that. Unfortunately, not all who acquire small studios do so with the intent of taking care of them, and instead they merely have their sights set on whatever IPs are on offer. Many big companies are guilty of this, though perhaps none is as notorious as EA, who have a long and sordid history of purchasing smaller studios and then almost immediately closing them down and making off with their properties. From Sims creators Maxis to Pandemic, the studio behind the OG Star Wars Battlefront series, EA really has acquired and then quickly shuttered the lot, claiming their popular games as their own as they skip away with reckless abandon. Sadly, they're just one symptom of a larger industry-wide problem, and one that continues to be a proper pain in the arse. Number 3. Crunch. If you are of job-having age, then you'll probably know that there are times when you need to work beyond your allotted hours in order to ensure that things get done. I'm recording this voiceover at 6:15 in the evening. If you work for a decent employer, like I do, they'll recognise your efforts and either compensate you accordingly or maybe give you time back in lieu. That is, of course, unless you work in the games industry, as it's commonplace for devs to work ridiculous hours when a release date is looming in order to ensure that a title is on shelves when it should be. We're not just talking about the odd extra hour here and there either. We're talking about employees forced to work 12+ hour days, 6 days a week, for weeks and weeks on end, often without any kind of recompense. Admittedly, some studios are getting better at avoiding crunch, but the problem is still present across the industry. As recently as January 2022, reports have surfaced from devs working at studios like TT Games, the people behind LEGO Star Wars The Skywalker Saga, that crunch is very much the norm. Rather than being used as an emergency tool for when things go wrong, it's simply how the work is scheduled. So the next time you see a game delayed, take a moment to think of the devs. That delay might just be saving them from working horrible conditions, sleeping under their desks, and eating Domino's day after day. That's not a good thing. Eating Domino's day after day is not a good thing. Number 2. Microtransactions. I bet you thought this was going to be number 1, didn't you? Indeed, over the years, we here at TripleJump have made no secret of the fact that we cannot stand microtransactions. And although there is a practice we think is worse, wait for number 1, we're going to continue banging the anti-microtransaction drum until such a time that our joints don't work anymore and our ears are ringing so badly that we can't hear you saying the word microtransactions. Now, don't get us wrong, as I've said multiple times throughout this list. If a piece of DLC comes out for a game, we're more than happy to shell out our hard-earned pennies for it when there's some actual content there. And if a particularly fancy character skin is released, then we can understand why a game would feel it necessary to charge a small fee to unlock it. After all, artists and devs are people, and they need to be paid so they can buy ridiculous things like rent and food. Thought they got all that at the office under their desks eating Domino's, don't they? What we really object to, though, are games that release with paywalls, i.e. content that's already good to go but has been excluded from the main game, which you probably just paid an awful lot of money for, unless you drop extra dollary dues. BioShock 2 and Mass Effect 3 are both excellent examples of this ridiculous practice, shipping with the content already on the disc but inaccessible unless players parted with their cash. Oh, and don't even get us started on pay-to-win mechanics. Those can get right in the pay-to-bin. And number 1, NFTs. Yes, our new favourite thing to hate down at TripleJump HQ is the NFT, the new kid on the horrible business practice block that's surely to be one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. The other 3, of course, being death, war, and Peter Molyneux. Sorry, For those unfamiliar with the concept, an NFT, or non-fungible token if you want to get less abbreviated about this, is, in very, very basic terms, a kind of cryptocurrency that sort of takes the form of anything digital, though the big hype at the moment is of course around digital artwork. People with more money than sense have been paying through the nose to get hold of some of the most valuable NFTs, and recently, video game companies have been getting in on the action as well. But what's the problem, Peter? People can spend their cash on art if they want to. Well, first of all, buying NFT artwork isn't like buying a Picasso when copying and pasting or screenshotting exists. Sure, people could create prints of a Picasso painting, but they won't be identical to the real thing, with the brushstrokes and the knowledge that Picasso himself probably sneezed on this canvas at one point. An NFT, on the other hand, can be copied in as little time it takes to right-click and save. NFT bros will assure you that no, that's just the same as doing a print of a painting, but it's not, is it? It's just not. All of this, of course, is without mentioning the fact that the blockchain technology used to house NFTs consumes a heck of a lot of power and is therefore harming the environment, just to add insult to injury. So, in summary, not only will that fancy new helmet kill your bank balance whilst lining the pockets of some CEO that's already bought 4 Ferraris this year, but it might also kill the polar bears too. You don't want to murder polar bears, do you?